Ever since the NFL draft was established as a means of keeping balanced play around the league and restricting new players' options and earning potential, it has been a crucial piece of the team-building process for any franchise worth its weight. Although you might think that an event that took place at a Philadelphia Ritz-Carlton hotel was some grand affair, when the NFL draft started way back in 1936, it had a rather humble beginning. During the first draft, the league owners filled one of the hotel's conference rooms, and 90 names were scribbled in chalk on an expansive blackboard in front of the room for all the owners to see. There were no scouting departments, no analytics, nothing like that. The pool of players was compiled of area talent that the owners had seen at a local college, had been recommended to them by a friend, or that they had read about in the newspaper. It's hard to fathom NFL teams using such rudimentary methods, especially after seeing how the modern-day draft has exploded into a full institution, along with the rest of the professional athletics industry. But even a behemoth like the NFL had to start somewhere. Nowadays, NFL teams have entire departments dedicated to talent evaluation, with specific employees who are responsible for developing a draft strategy. And that strategy is different for every organization. They need to attempt to estimate the market value for each of the team's draft targets, assess the team's roster needs, and eventually settle on a decision as to how they want to move forward. Then, once they select a player, there's a full-blown human resources department responsible for onboarding the new players, which helps to get them situated to, oftentimes, a new city, a new job, and life in the NFL. After which, it's time for the real work. Players are introduced to the organization's performance team, giving them access to strength and conditioning coaches and the athletic trainers, who help to assess where the players are at physically, and works hand in hand with the draftee to help them mold their bodies into a vehicle for peak performance. That could be millions of dollars right there alone. And that's not even taking into consideration the cost of adding new talent to the team's payroll. Needless to say, this is a pretty sizable investment from these teams, which I guess is to be expected since they are now run more like Fortune 500 companies rather than traditional sports franchises. The point being, there is no expense spared when it comes to running an NFL team. That is, if you want to run a competitive organization. It takes a legitimate, consistent financial investment, and having success in the NFL draft is no different. Of course, you need to have an eye for talent, but with the increased ease of understanding when it comes to advanced statistics and analytics, as well as the seamless access of a lifetime of game footage from every draft pick that is accessible to NFL teams at the push of a button, the playing field has very much been leveled. So a lot of franchises' success in the draft is tied to how much they're willing to invest financially in their process. And for teams, clearly, the answer is a lot. A lot. A lot of money goes into the draft. Even with so much at stake, both financially and in terms of acquiring talented players, it is rather shocking that somehow teams still find a way to completely botch their draft picks. Listen.
Hey! Listen!
I'm not saying that there is some foolproof system out there, nothing like that. I understand that at the end of the day, it is still just human beings making huge investments in other humans, who for one reason or another may or may not be motivated to succeed in the league. So sometimes, even the most surefire picks don't work out. That's just the reality of it. And mistakes happen. They do. But that being said, with so much at stake, it is utterly inconceivable that once draft day rolls around and the NFL teams find themselves on the clock, that not every team has their decisions completely mapped out, especially during the first couple rounds of the draft. If you ask me, they should have their top targets ready to go, and a procession of contingency plans right at their fingertips, telling them exactly what they're going to do and who they're going to take, based on which players the teams before them end up selecting. But for whatever reason, it seems like every year we see certain teams that always find a way to embarrass themselves as they fumble through the draft process in one way or another. It could be a bad pick or an embarrassing news leak. Anything, really. There is, however, one mistake that is so egregious that it is simply inconceivable, especially during the modern era of professional football. But teams still find a way to do it. As recently as 2011, too, when the Baltimore Ravens failed to submit their selection before the double zeros showed, causing them to forfeit their exclusive rights to the 26th pick. The Ravens are not alone in this dubious distinction, as the 2003 Minnesota Vikings were guilty of the same mistake, and they had their very own reasoning, if you will, for how it happened. Listen, I know that the teams have a limited window in which they can make decisions on their first round selections, but there are months and months of preparation that goes into this pick. At least there is supposed to be. They simply have to be better. Anyway, without further ado, let's take a look back at some of these recent shocking blunders and dive into the league-mandated repercussions that the teams in question faced and how their embarrassing draft day mistakes played out. Okay, From a league perspective, it needed to make sure that there was a stringent system in place to keep the draft moving along. Because of the obvious importance and focus placed on the first round selections, the NFL gives each team a 10-minute window to make a choice. And as the draft goes on, round by round, the window shrinks. First, down to 7 minutes in the second round, then 5 minutes in rounds 3 to 6, and finally 4 minutes in the 7th and final round. Usually, most teams don't have any trouble making their picks, but in the case that they do, the NFL operations team laid out very specific guidelines for how the draft is to proceed. Here's how the league explains the procedures for such an instance. If a team lets its time expire without making a choice, it can make a selection later, but it runs the risk of letting the next team on the clock take the player it was considering. In layman's terms, once a team's pick expires, its representatives have the choice to make a selection at any time, provided that the organization can settle on a player and relay the message to the league office before the team slotted next makes their choice. When this happened to the Baltimore Ravens back in 2011, they held the number 26 pick in the draft, but as the final second ticked away, Baltimore never entered a pick, thinking that it had inked a deal to send the pick to the Chicago Bears in exchange for their pick, the 29th overall and a 4th rounder. However, there was, in Bears general manager Jerry Angelo's words, a glitch and a disconnect. He continued to explain in a mess of words that didn't really say a whole lot. We had a disconnect, and there might be something said about it because of not communicating with the league and proper protocol. That was my fault, Angelo told reporters on Thursday. I called Baltimore and apologized to Baltimore and told them it was our fault. They did everything according to the rules, and we thought we were following everything, and we just ran out of time. It was a glitch on our part, and that glitch obviously was under my reign. What?
What?
Talk about a half-assed apology, if that's what we're gonna classify the lazy statement as. Needless to say, the Ravens owner Steve Bisciotti was incensed, both by the miscommunication and by Chicago's response. I'm disappointed in the Bears and the McCaskies, Bisciotti told the Baltimore Sun following the incident. It is, in my opinion, a deviation from their great legacy. They concluded that their heartfelt and admirable apology was sufficient for a loss. All of us at the Ravens strongly disagree. Probably end of story. Luckily, Baltimore recovered somewhat gracefully and was able to get their pick in eventually, with only Kansas City capitalized on the opportunity to get its selection in early, taking Jonathan Baldwin out of Pitt, who would only catch 44 passes in his brief NFL career. With the 26th-27th pick, Baltimore ended up making a much more productive selection in quarterback Jimmy Smith, who actually still plays for Baltimore. General manager Ozzie Newsome maintained that the Ravens intended on picking Smith all along. There was a potential for us to lose it, yes, but we got the player and we're just happy to have him. Nevertheless, the entire situation was embarrassing for the Ravens, and probably not the way that Smith dreamed up his entrance to the NFL. Perhaps Newsome was a bit more measured than Bisciotti in his response, because 8 years earlier, he had put the Minnesota Vikings in a similar situation. Newsome, who held the 19th overall pick, was working on closing a deal with Minnesota to move up to its number 7 slot, perhaps to take Byron Leftwich, a top quarterback prospect at the time out of Marshall. Back in 2003, teams had 15 minutes to make their first-round selection, giving both sides plenty of time to communicate and continuously counter one another. While the teams continued to barter, Minnesota shopped the pick to 2 other organizations that were both heavily interested, Jacksonville and New England. Finally, with about a minute left on the clock, Minnesota believed it had reached a deal with Newsome in Baltimore, and with 32 seconds remaining on the time limit, team officials turned their card into the NFL's official, Joel Bussert, indicating that a trade had been made. At least, that's what the Vikings brass maintain happened. Newsome, on the other hand, would tell the Associated Press the deal was not consummated. A deal is not a deal until I talk to Joel Bussert, and I never talked to Joel Bussert. Minnesota thought that they now had until pick 19 to make a selection. Meanwhile, no official transaction had been made, and the teams behind them began to capitalize. First, Jacksonville, who held the next pick, rushed in to take Leftwich. Then, Carolina jumped in, taking the All-American offensive tackle out of the University of Utah, Jordan Gross. The Vikings war room was sent reeling. Fortunately for Minnesota, they were able to regain composure before a third team could slide in. And with the 9th selection, they took Kevin Williams, the defensive tackle out of Oklahoma State. And just like Steve Bisciotti years later, the Vikings execs were none too pleased with the nonchalance that Baltimore exercised following the miscommunication. I'm pissed, said Vikings coach Mike Tice. There is no other way I can put it. As it turned out, the Vikes lucked out and got a good one in Williams, who surely wouldn't have been available if they had traded down to 19. During his 10 seasons in Minnesota, Williams was selected to 6 Pro Bowls and 5 first-team All-Pros, including 4 in a row between 2006 and 2009. As for the other teams, the Jaguars got a solid quarterback in Leftwich, who is a starter in the league for years. And Baltimore got Kyle Bowler, which, if you ask me, is punishment fit for the crime. We haven't seen a team botch a draft like this since the Ravens in 2011, but who knows? After all, it apparently only takes one little breakdown in communication to completely derail draft day for an organization. Which do you think is the biggest draft day screw-up in NFL history? Join us in the comment section below. If you liked this video and learned a thing or two, clicking the like button helps us out a ton, and we appreciate it. If this is your first time coming around to TPS though, subscribing is a great idea because we put out videos like this every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.